No estás sesco. Dice, estás muteada. No estoy muteada, no estoy muteada.
Hola. Hola. Okay, welcome everyone back. So now we have the second part of the session. And we have three speakers, and the first of them is Estela Romero from the CREAF. And the title of her talk is Healthy Foods, Healthy Rivers, Healthy Oceans, the Impacts of Diets and Agro-Food Scenarios on Fresh Waters and Coastal Waters.
Okay, so can you hear me properly? Can you hear me properly? Is it fine? Okay. So, well, my name is Estela. Romero just said that, and it's my pleasure to be here, honestly, and to be the one starting with this issue of global health. So, what I would like to talk about today is something that I've been working on for the past few years, which is very well connected to this thing of how the health of ecosystem is connected to human health. And it has to do with what you see here, with how the food we eat and the way we produce that food has an impact on the health of fresh waters, or the quality, let's say, of fresh waters and coastal waters. And let me just briefly talk about my research with this one slide. I basically work with the biogeochemical cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, and how these cycles and how these flows affect aquatic ecosystems. And that is very much related with these planetary boundaries that I guess you are all familiar with. You've probably seen this nice figure here. You're probably also familiar with this concept of the boundaries or the thresholds that we should not surpass if we want to maintain the planet healthy. And, well, in the planetary boundaries, and with regard to those boundaries, the biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus are a big issue. We are way beyond what is the safe operating space. And, but there are many implications with these flows, because on these two elements relies the world agricultural production. So food security is a very big implication. But there's also water security, because a large part of these flows enter fresh waters. They have an impact on the quality of those waters, and they can be, well, they can impair water quality, and they can make scarcity and water availability a bigger challenge. And that is a real problem in many places, such as the Mediterranean, such as Catalonia, where we are experiencing very long-term droughts. Water, well, is not always that easy or that available as it used to be. So, you know, it's something to take into account. There's also this thing that, depending on the balance of nitrogen and phosphorus, we can also see effects on the structure and function of ecosystems. That's been seen in terrestrial systems, also in marine systems. So, the other nice thing about the biogeochemical cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus is that they are very useful to track this land-to-ocean continuum. So they're very interesting elements, because they prove that actually many of the activities we have on land impact the health and functioning of rivers, impact the health and functioning of estuaries, and of course the health and functioning and the dynamics of coastal systems. And to prove you that, I will use just one case study today, which is the Seine River Basin. The Seine River is a wonderful case study because it is a representative temperate river in Europe, where we have high nutrient loads, which come both from urban sources and agricultural sources. We have the best available technology in terms of wastewater treatment facilities. So we know how to deal with point sources, let's say. And especially what makes it a very nice case study is that it's been a very well monitored river basin. We've got 50-year time series of data. It's a complete data set, very reliable information, and with that, you can have this type of graphs where you can actually very quickly, you can see the evolution of water quality. So you've got phosphate on top and then nitrate below. And you see the x-axis is from the 70s to 2015. And you've got, you see here a long stretch of the river. So it's Paris to Honfleur at the very end of the story. And you can quickly see that in terms of phosphate, water quality has improved a lot for the past decades. So we had very large concentrations in the 70s, but at a certain point, actually mid-90s, phosphate concentrations decreased a lot, and we've had low concentrations and healthy stages, let's say, in terms of phosphate, for the past 2 to 3 decades, but the opposite trend for nitrate. So concentrations were not that high in the 70s, but then started to increase in the 90s and have increased steadily just until 2013, something like that, when they started to decrease. So you can quickly see, these two trends. When you've got such a complete data set, you can actually analyze whether the turning points in the time series match, specific, the passing of specific environmental regulations, whether they match with the common agricultural policy reforms, whether we see improvements when there is a technological advancement in terms of wastewater treatment plants and things like that, and that's what we did here. So we could actually see whether some European regulations had been effective or not in terms of improving water quality. The other interesting thing when you have such a nice data set is, of course, building and validating models. And that's exactly what we did here. It's actually not one model, but it's actually a modeling chain. So we coupled 3 different models. So we've got the GRAPS model, which deals with the terrestrial input of nutrients and basically takes into account all things related to the agri-food system. Then the results of graphs feed the river Straller, which considers all the transformations that take place in the hydro system. And river Straller is coupled to this EcoMars 3D, which takes into account the dynamics of the estuary and the bay. And I just had this highlight here, the estuarine processes, because that was a big novelty of this project. We actually adapted this EcoMars 3D model, which was marine, to include the estuarine processes. And that was something that had not been done before. Why not? Well, because estuaries are fairly complex. We know they are powerful, or they can be powerful biogeochemical reactors, but they are complex. And it's not easy to model their functioning. So you can see a map of the Seine estuary here. What we had what was very challenging was the downstream. We've got huge morphological changes. So you see that the final part of the estuary is basically a straight channel. That was because, well, they wanted to ease navigation. Believe it or not, this is a very, this estuary supports a very crazy, frantic activity. So I've written that, so 60% of all French exchanges in agricultural goods pass through the Seine estuary, which is a massive amount of exchanges. And then upstream, we've got lots of urban pressures. So we've got Rouen, but we've got Paris city. So in the lowest part of the river, it's about 12 million people living. So yeah, it's a lot. And so, taking into account all the transformations was pretty complicated. We had, all those processes there. We had to calibrate the sedimentary dynamics, then the tidal propagation, and then, of course, consider that we had freshwater cells and also marine cells. And that was a difficult job, but I'll spare you the details. We really had a nice modeling chain, operative and working and well validated. And once you've got your model up and running, well, the fun part is to set up scenarios. And that was what we did. And just take into account that projections were for 2050, sorry, and I just show you here two of them, kind of two extremes. So one is this agroecological scenario, which represents a real bold ecological transition. And this one is the Grand Paris, so it's kind of, I've written that, it's like a premium business as usual. And many differences between the two, basically related to this transition of the agri-food systems. But you see that in here we limit the urban expansion, while in here we've got Grand Paris. So we let the Paris agglomeration, we let it grow. So we also use, a very large difference here is that we changed our diets. So in here we have the consumption of meat and dairy. And we favor vegetal proteins. So let's say, protein of vegetal origin. And while in here we don't change that, so we actually have the share of animal protein that we have right now and the amount of nitrogen, the consumption of nitrogen that we have right now, so it's not substantial changes here. And in here we also, big changes here have to do with lower the use of synthetic fertilizers and reconnecting livestock farming and crop farming. Also, a decrease in the cattle density because there are no feed imports. In this one, we've got basically the same system as we have right now, highly intensified in terms of livestock, highly intensified in terms of crop, and complete disconnection. So we have stockless crop farming, and the two things are separated. But this is a business as usual premium because we've got these end-of-pipe treatments, and we consider that we have the best available technology. So it's technologically optimistic, plus we've got very strict environmental regulations. So it's like now, but very controlled. And just out of curiosity, which one do you think is closer to the farm-to-fork measures that are discussed so much? Which one do you think is closer, the agroecological or the Grand Paris? Some people, the agroecological, well, actually the farm-to-fork aims at this, but it's really much more similar to this. So this is what we want. This is, actually the farm-to-fork is something in the middle. I won't show you. We had that scenario. I'm not showing this today, but the results are pretty much like the ones we have here. A little bit better, but pretty much like the ones you see for the red one. Well, as I said, many differences are related to the agri-food systems and to our own diets. So in the first one, I didn't say that, but in the first one, when we say we have the consumption of meat and dairy, we actually follow the suggestions of the Eat Lancet Commission, actually, what was said that to be good for our health was imposed here. In here, we do not change food choices. So we have the ones we have right now, lots of animal protein, lots of processed food, and that was a spoiler alert. So food choices have a lot to do because if you have this type of diet instead of this one, you require, to a greater or a lesser extent, agricultural intensification. So actually to show you that, when you shift from the reference to the agroecological and you change the diet, you need to produce a lot less, or you do not require such high yields in croplands, let's say, and that allows you to stop synthetic fertilizers. And it's very important to reconnect with livestock farming. It's very important to increase the share of leguminous crops. And it is very important to change the rotations in croplands. So you really have to have that in order to get the yields you require. But I wanted to tell you that actually these scenarios do not come out of the blue. It's nothing that we invented and that's it. They have actually been tested, and we know that they are productive enough to achieve food and feed self-sufficiency in France. So it's not, like a crazy thing, but it's actually, you get to produce enough food to feed the French population, and you have an extra, let's say, for international export. So they are efficient scenarios, let's say. So what is the impact in terms of freshwater quality? I show you here for nitrate, the whole basin, and you see that the difference between the reference and the agroecological scenario is very clear. So and sorry I didn't say that, so the color codes correspond to the European regulations, so the environmental status, either high, one from high to bad, so you see. And for the agroecological scenario, we've got basin-wide good quality status, so the mainstream and all tributaries are at minimum in moderate conditions, which was very good. What does it happen with the Grand Paris? Well, we've got a clear improvement upstream, but actually all tributaries in the lowest part of the basin get worse. So we have consistent concentrations above 5 milligrams of nitrogen per liter. So it is not very good, actually. What happens with phosphate? Well, with phosphate, even in the reference, we really had, good water quality. In the two scenarios, it even improves a little bit, but there are no clear differences. So actually, for the Grand Paris, results are pretty good as well. Why is that? Well, because phosphorus from point sources is well controlled, even right now, so we have not a problem with that. What happens with phosphorus from diffuse sources? So phosphorus is mainly bound to soil particles, and it means that it is basically determined by erosion. We did not change the rate of erosion between the two scenarios, so there were not substantial differences in terms of that. Plus, it is very determined by legacy effects. So the phosphorus we see now is the phosphorus that's been accumulated in the past 30 to 40 years. So not a lot of differences between the two scenarios. That is why, even now, we have good quality. And what happens in terms of marine eutrophication? Well, let's say to assess marine eutrophication, we've used this ISEP index, so it's the index of coastal eutrophication potential. It's not any index, it's the one that's been selected by United Nations to follow target 14.1 of this SDG 14. And it actually, well, there are many ways to measure this, but this particular index takes into account the algal biomass that can be built up considering the nitrogen or phosphorus available in excess over silica. That, of course, means that we assume that this surplus of nitrogen and phosphorus may foster the growth of non-siliceous phytoplankton, and in particular dinoflagellates. Why is that? Well, because in the sand bay, it is mostly dinoflagellates that cause nuisance blooms. So it makes sense to use this index of coastal eutrophication. And you see the results here for Le Havre, so like at the very end of the story as well. So that's, let's say, what gets into coastal waters. So you see for nitrogen, we consistently have nitrogen in excess over silica in all three scenarios. For the reference, nitrogen is clearly in excess over silica, for the Grand Paris as well, and the only one in which that excess decreases substantially is the agroecological scenario. Means that we have, once silica is depleted, we have nitrogen leftovers that can be used by non-siliceous phytoplankton. What happens with phosphorus is the opposite. So it seems that phosphorus may be limiting primary production, and you see it's negative in all three scenarios. Phosphorus may be actually acting kind of as a natural firewall and limiting these blooms, at the outlet of the river. And as in a map, let's see, so to see what happens in the bay, you see on top the reference for chlorophyll and for dinoflagellates, and what you see here is the scenario minus the reference, so the difference between the two. And not many differences actually between the Grand Paris and the agroecological. we actually suspect there should be more differences for the dinoflagellates, but we suspect that we used an annual time step. If we only focused on summer variations, we could see more differences. But anyhow, the take home, what I want to make clear after this is that all our simulations show that actually to guarantee freshwater quality and have good stages in estuaries and coasts, we really need to transition to our ecological systems. Otherwise, we can be very optimistic about technology. It won't improve. There's no chance to have, good health in rivers and oceans if we do not change activities on land. And that's why we need healthy food to have healthy rivers and healthy oceans. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Estela. Questions?
Thank you very much for the talk. And regarding this scientific part to push into politics, how do you deal with the? How do you see now the Política Agraria Común? I don't know how to say that but you understand? Or?
Yeah.
How I don't know. So how do you think that we can pass this further apart from generating cultural change? How do you think that?
Well, I think they've received the message. There are many things being done, and there's lots of pressure in terms of, have to be ambitious for the Capri forums, and they know the message is very clear, and they know that. I know, as well, it's very complicated. There are many things. When we say we have to transition in the way we produce food, but it means we have to change as well the supply chain, let's say. It takes a while, but in terms of these cycles and this absolute excess of nitrogen and how we should change these things, they know. And important thing, they know it's feasible. So we are able to produce enough food. So I don't know how to, but I think the message is at least well known in European, instances.
I'll try and jump. It's fascinating to see the modelling that you're doing, and I'm not familiar with it at all. But being familiar with modelling of other systems, I'm just curious. So, for example, the parameter values that regulate many parts of the model, can you say sort of, roughly speaking, whether these values mostly come sort of as attempted direct measurements out of the system, or whether they're sort of like fitted parameters from seeing the behavior of the system? I mean, because you can kind of have these two broad, different categories of how you get all these parameter values, sometimes measuring them as almost mechanistic things out of the system, or just fitting them. How does it work with this kind of modeling, which I'm not familiar with?
Well, actually, modeling, if there should be here, the picture of also 50 people, because it's not, only me, of course, doing that. So there's many people working in the graphs thing, there's many people working in the hydro system. The sun is tricky because it's so well monitored, and we've got measures for so long and reliable in many parts of the basin that it was kind of, it's a 50-50 things. But it's very well validated because we've got measures everywhere. And I didn't show, but there are many parts like, emissions, it's climate smart as well. This transition, I think it's half the emissions of greenhouse gases, and it's many other environmental benefits, let's say. But for the EcoMars, I know it was adjusted, but then for the estuary, we had so much data that we could actually use, both approaches. But in the marine part, I think it was mostly adjusted. For the hydro system and for the graphs is very we know, the amount of crops, of a specific crop, and we know the fertilization rates, and we know, because there's measurements, how much gets into groundwater and how much gets into surface runoff. So that's not fitted, let's say, we know for sure because there are many measurements, so I wouldn't, I'll tell you it's a 50-50 thing, but it's a specific case in the Seine. In many others, because that's been done for many other river basins in France, I'd say it's mostly fitted because it's not so well validated.
It looks fascinating. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, Pierre.
Hello, thanks. I wanted to ask you, what do you consider is an agroecological system? So what does it imply for agriculture, actually?
Yeah,
I guess it's a contrast between the heavy monoculture fertilized soils compared to less fertilized soil, but can you expand on the
Yeah,
the
no, I
concept?
didn't get into too much detail. In here, agroecological systems means first, let's say, diet choices and food choices change because we have to have 60% of our proteins from vegetal sources, and then it means changing the yields. I mean, we don't have to have such high yields. Since we don't need such high yields, we completely avoid synthetic fertilizers, but to avoid synthetic fertilizers, we still need, to add nitrogen and phosphorus, so we need a reconnection with livestock farming. So that's one thing. This reconnection between livestock and croplands, that's imperative. That's one thing. The other thing is that we have more atmospheric fixation because there's this valorization of leguminous crops. And we have longer and more varied crop rotations. So that allows you to recover a little bit the nutrients in the soil. So there are many, I didn't say many other things, but there's, of course, we have to decrease food waste. There's no feed import, means that we have to reduce the amount of livestock that we have. But it's not necessary because we have decreased the share of animal protein. So there are many things implicit in these diet changes. What are the things about these agro-food systems? I don't know. There are many things. I can send you the papers. But yeah, there are many specific lines there to guarantee that your soil is productive enough, but that you don't have this terrible excess flows of nitrogen and phosphorus spreading all over. Are there examples, sorry?
Are there examples in action of such systems?
Working, not at this scale, but this was tested at the scale of France, also of Europe, and it was, as I said, we achieved food and feed self-sufficiency. And not at this scale, but at smaller scales, at the plot scale, that's been tested. So yeah, but not in such a massive, but yeah, at the plot scale, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Estela. So our next speaker is Ricard Solé from the UPF and IBE, right? And the title of his talk is Tackling Ecosystem Tipping Points with Emergent Bioengineering.
All right. So I need to find out my presentation. You can help.
You can close this one.
Here?
Yeah.
Doesn't want to close.
No, it doesn't close.
Okay. Yeah, the last one.
And I guess this is Control L, no?
I don't know. Use the Mac.
Yo también.
Okay. So thanks a lot. My presentation is going to be different. So I'm not coming from lots of data and experiments, and it's not water there. It's drylands. So I'm like a hater here. Well, I'm glad to be here. I really enjoyed the previous talks. I'm really fascinated. It came to my mind after the end of some of them. We have to talk, right? I know that after these 4 words, nothing good comes, but you have to talk. So this presentation is about an idea that we presented some years ago, and has to do with the problems that are going to be there. That's what I used to say, but the problems are here already. I remember once in the Santa Fe Institute, there was a talk by someone working on climate, making predictions about what's going to happen ahead in the next century, saying things like, big floods in Central Europe, mega fires in California, et cetera, et cetera. It sounded like a very precise list, which of course, in a way, got short because things are accelerating. And we are enjoying that ourselves here. This is one of the dams that we had in Catalonia, Pantà de Sau. And also there's the problem of extremes, which in a way deviates from the typical logic of thinking in average values. Extremes are a problem in themselves. And that comes, of course, from climate change. And I want to point out that one of the big issues here is the outcomes of the nonlinear nature of climate and ecological systems. This comes from a paper that I wrote recently with my colleague at Princeton, Simon Levine, ecological complexity in the biosphere the next 30 years. It's been also pointed out here, the 2050 kind of a horizon where many things might be really, really bad unless we have done something. I put here several examples from, let me see if this works. It doesn't, right? From drylands, which is the topic I'm going to cover, right? The prediction is this about 2050, more than 50% of terrestrial ecosystems will be drylands, right? Which is more than 10% the actual numbers. And the disgraceful example of coral reefs, I think it's a very good illustration of how far we are from really catching up the scale of the problem. Because I remember 20 years ago, there's this book, 6 Degrees of Separation, 6 degrees, sorry, concerning about what happens if you increase 1 degree, 2 degrees the temperature. And they were saying the prediction was by 2050, half of coral reefs will be gone or seriously damaged, but that already happened, right? So, and I'm going to explain kind of an approximation we are taking about this. To a large extent, this is based on modeling approaches, the lessons we have learned from models. I know that people get skeptical about this, but I'll try to convince you why models are a good approximation. And I put Sonia Kefi here, which is one of the most gifted people in this area. And the big problem that we kind of face is that the response of ecosystems on the long time scale are not going to be smooth. That's one thing that models consistently predict, right? That you increase, for example, soil degradation in a dryland or aridity, kind of a surrogate of that. Things might seem to occur smoothly and nicely, but then at some point you cross critical point, which is kind of an inevitable property of complexity. It's something that you cannot avoid in most cases. And I put the case here of the Tenger Desert case study, very briefly saying that this was a place in China where you have these sand dunes moving and crossing the railroads, so it was a serious infrastructure problem. So I decided to make a very high-scale engineering process where essentially they covered a stripe of 18 kilometers by 500 meters wide, so that's only the Chinese can do that. And they put there huge amounts of haystack in this configuration. There was a lot of effort put there, a very serious effort. I think that very good lessons have been learned from there, but you have to really put this effort. Why? Because it's not enough that once you cross the boundary, you get in this direction. You are not going to get up, right? There's a hysteresis problem. So you have to invest a lot to actually put the system back into the original or a surrogate of the original state, right? So tipping points, something that politicians tend to avoid all the time. So what are the consequences of these tipping points? I just want to point it out. There's many examples of these. We have the paleo evidence for them. This study in Nature that makes the study of this part of Africa. If you look in Google Earth, here it's easy to see that it looks like a dune field, right? But it's not a desert. The dunes are freeze by vegetation, right? It's been there for very, very long time. But the prediction is you increase temperatures beyond a given threshold, vegetation will go up, and essentially this becomes a desert. And This is a scale of country scale, right? So the problems associated to that, and probably far before anything of that happens, will be humanitarian catastrophe will be tremendous. What can be done? All right. So before I keep going, I'm not suggesting a techno fix. I'm not one of these economists who say, don't worry, give up the planet because somebody will fix it out, right? That's not the idea. We have to do a lot of stuff, right? Starting from what we have heard before, and things have to do with sustainable growth and taking care of resources in a rational way. But things are going fast and maybe accelerating. So are there scenarios for intervention? And geoengineering, as some of you know well, has been there as a proposal for a long time. Geoengineering meaning that you can inject, making these huge machines that nobody has done before, to inject steam in the atmosphere, or building millions of mini satellites with mirrors that could deflect the light of the sun. Of course, that doesn't solve the CO2 problem, right? It's just like, let's put the thing kind of under lower temperature. So is this going to work? The numbers that don't give any good positive message here. We don't have that technology for that in case of geoengineering, and as you also probably know, the idea of aerosols, which is something we can consider, still, it's something that implies a huge investment, probably staggering costs, and clear damage, right? So there's another alternative, of course, which is the nonsense, right? It's our dear friend Ellen suggests that why not go to Mars, right? In case of anyone wants arguments about why not to Mars, because Mars is going to kill us, there's a very good paper here. All right. I bet he's not going to volunteer for the first mission. Anyways, so what is our suggestion, right? It's a big idea. It's something that we have been proposed 9 years ago, and comes from a conceptual framework, which is the following. Why not consider bioengineering, right? Consider bioengineering means why not to take advantage of one important fact, which is that we start to navigate into synthetic biology, into changing microorganisms, because microorganism is the target here. That's why it's so important to learn about microorganisms on the global scale and understand what's going on. And what if we were able to change something that takes advantage of biology, which means that you don't have to build millions of machines to actually have an effect. Biology has a great property. Our systems self-replicate themselves. Okay? So that's kind of the starting idea. And I put all these papers not to say, hey, look at how many papers. It's just to highlight something which is kind of fun. This is the literature, right? Which essentially we produce. Well, the good thing is that over the last 5 years, we start to see papers in Science, Nature, etc., saying, hey, maybe synthetic biology has to be taken seriously. So we are not alone. The picture again is, just very briefly, this is a space we built about engineering approximations, is that bioengineering in terms of the costs is something that is reliable and feasible, and I'm trying to convince you that this is the case, right? Whereas geoengineering, by definition, so far, implies high cost. So, what is the idea of terraformation? We say terraformation because the idea is not to terraform Mars, which is a great idea, not for us, but it's a great idea in general, but to actually transform the biosphere, or locally, mesoscale, who knows, in ways that allow us to persist. So, create a synthetic organism able to spread, right? The second is, which is, I'll tell you about that, the scale we are now working, micro-mesocosm context to test if this is feasible, right? Because easy to say with a model, but not so easy to be sure that this is going to work. And then see if this is scalable. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Yeah, but what about the famous unintended consequences, right? I take Jurassic Park because this is kind of the basic idea. You have a complex system, you pretend you can control it, right? And it's going to get wrong, right? In the movies in particular, it's going to go wrong. Well, is that the case? And I want you to point out about this question, precise question. Is really the case? Do we have an answer for this question, whether or not it's going to have unintended consequences? And I made the analogy with the question, if I ask you, you think there's life somewhere else, I'm sure that almost all of you, except some very pessimistic person, will say, yeah, I believe so. But you believe, right? That's not a proof. So what are the consequences of injecting, inoculating a manipulated organism in nature, right? Where, by the way, horizontal gene transfer is happening all the bloody time and nothing terrible happens, as far as I can see. Well, we have to approach this, and I want to mention that our approach is synthetic biology, and I want to take you into this particular example that is known in the area, which is treating concrete cracks. Concrete cracks is a major infrastructure problem because concrete, which is actually, after plastics, is probably the most big anthropogenic material that is there, but tends to make cracks with time. And then when you have the cracks, water comes in and destroys the rest, right? So an idea that people brought was, what if I could engineer a strain that is engineered, produces some polymer plus calcium carbonate, and this makes a very strong material that is kind of filling out the crack. That has been done, right? As usual, from the lab to the reality, it takes a while. But the idea is these bacteria are pretty much adapted to an environment that is basic, and it's easy to design them in such a way that when the work is done, if you get out from the crack, this is a very hostile environment. You're going to die, right? So the motto, which is kind of North Korean motto, work and die. So that's the idea of the construct. So is it possible to actually design things in ways that allow us to have a control, so to speak? And I want to make the point that control is not the right term. You'll see why. Well, in my lab, which has a long history of ecological modeling, some years ago we started to also work on synthetic biology. It kind of makes sense to join forces, and over the years we got, I think, a good intuition about how to think out of the box. And we choose drylands, among other things. Plastics is also in our list, CO2 removal also, but dryland is the scenario where we have made more progress, in part because we join forces with people that knows a lot about that. So real field ecologists, like Fernando Maestre. And it's a really fascinating problem. I must admit that 20 years ago, if somebody told me that it's interesting to look at ecosystems in drylands, I would have said, well, it's not like a rainforest, right? But it turns out that it's extremely fascinating, has multiple scales of complexity, from the community scale to the things that happen on the soil crust, which are an amazing system where a lot of CO2 exchanges and a lot of stuff happens in terms of making ecosystem reliable, right? Allows actually to explore this experimentally, right? So to test these ideas. So to test what exactly? Oh, this is just to mention that we also have done our homework in terms of analyzing data. This is from a science paper we published a few years ago, taking data from 60,000, that's a global scale, drylands, to see what kind of shifts are we expecting to see, which involve from ecosystem degradation to complete collapse, right? And gathering data in trying to understand what's going on. So the first thing as a theoretician you can do is to do the same thing that you find in an ecology textbook, right? When you start, usually you end up into having the local terra model, prey-predator, competition, etc. So we do the basic mathematics of that. And we started with that, doing the population dynamics of this, and showing that it's actually possible to define what we call terraformation motifs, which means that you can define a few components, right? Of course, collapsing a lot of things, right? We know we have a complex, diverse community, but let's imagine that they can take vegetation cover, assuming that this is something homogeneous, a soil where I'm going to inoculate my microorganism. And a very important concept is that we don't take a microorganism from out of the blue. We take someone who is already in the community, a wild type, so you have the context, you modify very, very little modification. And in particular, to illustrate the case, the idea that we propose is, imagine that my synthetic strain, which if it doesn't work, is going to lose the construct that we put there and become wild type, right? Can act, for example, on water leakness. Imagine that I can do the following, which is quite reasonable. I engineer my microorganism, it releases a kind of polysaccharide, or maybe something that is not even observable in nature, that is able to have a little more water retention, right? Little more is important because there's no water, essentially, in these ecosystems. And on the other hand, a little in these systems that can amplify this kind of parameters can be enough. And our first work showed that you can actually show that the tipping point can be displaced, right? That doesn't mean that we are not in trouble, right? But we might have more time to do something, okay? Just to mention that, not going into the details, of course you can say, this is a model, right? So how confident are you on that? And the idea is, don't try only one model. Let's go, for example, into a spatial system where we go into more detailed explanation about microbial interactions. We have space, we have noise. So is this robust in relation with the first model? And the answer is yes, right? So this is a good indication, which we also are trying to actually connect with things that we've been finding out recently, like this paper we just published a few weeks ago on the fact that vegetation cover actually is in part responsible of the health, if you want, of the system. So the big question, of course, Jurassic Park. Yes, but imagine you have many species. How do you know that if I change something, it is not going to propagate and initiate a cascade of extinctions, for example, right? It's a totally legitimate question, especially because we tend to think in invaders like the rabbits in Australia, right? You put a species that is an alien species and it creates a massive catastrophe, right? People doesn't mention that in Australia, we first came humans, we killed all the predators, we brought some millions of sheep and camels, and so kind of the environment was not exactly ready for anything good. So the idea is, and I've done this with my student Victor Maul, is go back into the idea that I take someone that is in the community, but make it explicit. So we have a network of species, right? I choose my wild type, okay, which has, I'll give you an architecture, which I don't pretend to change a lot. This is very, very small engineering. I make the changes necessary to secrete the molecule I want, right, and put it back. Which means that the context, the coevolutionary context of this species is preserved, right, which is very different, and I want to emphasize that with a top-down standard engineering, where you're supposed to actually do something that is going to control these and these and these in a predictable way. What we want is actually to make biodiversity to be maintained. That's a crucial thing, because if the system is biodiverse, it's going to be healthy, right? So we explore this. Again, this is kind of the basic loop that we have here, right? And we have explored this, assuming, for example, in an explicit way that our microorganism is going to, for example, reduce the leakness of water, but could be another resource, right? You do the maths, and what you see is, this is a cumulative frequency distribution of population changes, right? This is logarithmic scale, I want to point out, right? You do the introduction of your microorganism, a manipulated one, and you see how populations shift. And the message of what we have done, and we have done a very deep analysis of robustness, is that the vast majority of populations essentially do not change, right? And this is, again, logarithmic means that if I plot this in standard scale, there will be a huge peak going down, right? And almost nothing happens, except a little bias into the positive direction. Populations increase. So we have been testing this very seriously, and that's my message. What about unintended consequences? If you do this kind of engineering, there are no unintended consequences. Just to mention, we've been extending this and trying to think other scenarios. One of them was suggested by our colleague, Victor de Lorenzo, who is one of the world leaders in synthetic biology. And he suggested this idea of not creating a species, but building a plasmid that brings some function that can easily spread across species, right? Which is something that could be advantageous, right? He uses the term promiscuous plasmid, which is, and we are writing this paper, and the first title that came out was massive spreading. Everything sounds so bad, so we have to really change this. But the idea is that they actually tested this in controlled conditions using soil samples, and it seems to work. So that's another possibility. Let me just very briefly mention, because we're excited about this, we have also studied another context where interventions could be relevant in the future. We've been mapping the Barcelona microbiome, or microbiomes. And here also are suggested possibilities of actually terraforming this kind of microbiome. Let me say, I'm almost finished, that there's a context where this is going to help in two directions. In biomedical research, the idea that we can actually manipulate the microbiomes is becoming a reality, right? In terms of the gut microbiome as a way of curing some diseases. The skin microbiome, this is from a group of people here, led by my colleague, Mark Weil, in terms of the skin microbiome. And there's plenty of opportunities for people working on very different scales, very different problems. There's a scheme that comes from my paper with Levin. Again, the interaction between people doing modeling and the people trying to figure out scenarios for restoration, but also maybe for terraformation are there. There's plenty of great opportunities, and the good thing is that it's been 9 years, and it's been really a nightmare to kind of convince agencies to give money to this project. The reason is obvious, right? Because, the unintended consequences, the bad message that this can give, et cetera, et cetera. Luckily for us, AMBL decided to support our project as one of the flagships, and we just are in the first phases of starting experiments. So we have 2 postdocs working on the models, a facility, the Nano Fab Lab, which is a great facility for us. And this week, the Mesocosm is coming to the lab. So we are happy as children with a cake. And of course, there's a lot of things to think about, right? That implies a lot of things in terms of what is our relationship with natural systems, what's going to happen in the future if this goes on. But of course, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want? Right? It's clear that we are doing everything wrong already, so we need to think about that. And I want to thank all my colleagues that have been working on this, from my PhD students to postdocs and great senior collaborators, everyone much smarter than myself, and I really enjoyed working with them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ricard. Very nice. We have time for 1-2 questions, I think. Maria?
Thank you. Very nice talk. Very interesting. I have the feeling you are taking a super complicated way, right, to design bacteria, to make the bacteria to do what we want to do, and so on. And sometimes it came to my mind when you show the human body that for the gut microbiome, you know that they do this transplant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that dirty thing. But it's like, it's a pure inoculation, and it works much better than just adding engineered bacteria into the gut microbiome, because it's so complex that these bacteria, it's hard for them to success in that community. So why not in the environment the same thing? Why not, just inoculating? It comes to my mind like when they were doing these iron fertilization experiments in the oceans, that they had to stop because it was getting out of control, but they were just adding iron, to enhance CO2 fixation. So in case of the dry lands, maybe if you inoculate soil, it's right on the board, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Instead of inoculating.
Okay. there are several things. About the iron thing, I heard kind of mixed views about the non-control. But nevertheless, let me say that we applied for a grant recently, Biodiversa grant, actually suggesting the idea of transplants, right, for soil microbiomes, where there's little history about that. We failed because one of our partners failed to make some bureaucratic single thing and everything collapsed. So, but yeah, we have this in mind, absolutely. That doesn't mean that, and I will disagree about saying that engineering a microorganism for the gut, because there start to be examples of that. We are in our infancy in trying to do this. Clearly, the transplant is a very interesting path, which we don't understand very well how it works, right? That's something we have to admit. In soil ecosystems, so kind of inoculations of cyanobacteria with some context have been used in the past. And the thing is that they actually support our idea that this can improve soil quality, but it's always transient. Sooner or later, the effects are gone. So that's why we think that we need to bring something that might be a mixture of the two things, who knows? Plus, we're also thinking about niche construction ideas. But that's something is in our agenda also. Yeah, absolutely.
Because it may be just constant input also in the case of the movement.
Yeah. That's the other thing we have to consider. Like in a chronic disease, right? You have a treatment that has to be put there again and again. So that's actually the exciting things that are going to happen in the lab now, because we all have the mesocosm and all these uncertainties about what's going to happen, because we are going to use real samples from soil crust. We'll start to know. So we'll see. I hope in a year to be more clear about that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Many of the organismal responses to environmental factor like temperature are not linear. So you have like the reaction norm can change the slope or the tipping point, and particularly the second one is subjected to frequency-dependent selection. So this is more a theoretical question, no? But these modifications, then, would you expect to be counteracted by this frequency-dependent selection, perhaps?
Well, this is the next research we have in plants. So far, we haven't taken into account evolution. Also because in our dreams, of course. There's these examples that you might have heard by Martin Scheffer, where they apply this change in a shallow lakes that are eutrophic, they are totally green, by a manipulation, which was suggested by a theoretical model, by the way. And you can shift the system into the crystal clear state. Is this something that might happen in our context? We don't know. The evolutionary context might play a role, but it's difficult to know. And of course, the models require an extension for temperature, which we have some ideas about how to include. But this, yeah, it's totally on our lines. Yeah.
How did they ship the lake?
Excuse me? Oh, the lakes. Yeah, they removed the large fish. That was done. It's an interesting story because they did that starting with a purely theoretical model with a bistable bifurcation, and they predicted if you remove the big fish, it shifts. So they did in a fish tank, and it worked. And they convinced the mayor of some village, I mean, someone who had not much criterion about anything, and they did it. So with using nets, they removed the large fish, and the lakes shift. So I think it's a success story.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to move on.
Thank you.
So our next and last speaker is Josep Maria Antó from the East Global Institute of Global Health, right? And he's talk about, the title of his talk is Planetary Health, Protecting Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch.
What is the just let me here? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. Can you go back? Here. This. Okay. So thank you very much. A big pleasure to be here. I'm aware that we are totally out of time, so I can understand if you want to go directly to the questions. So big pleasure. I think that very thanks to the organizers and to James Sharp for the invitation. I think that this is the result of a conversation we had 6 years ago about asthma, the epidemic of asthma among humans. And I just now not work anymore on asthma, but I work in a new thing that it's called planetary health. I will take a few minutes to take your attention to this idea of planetary health. And this, you have seen this framework and different presentations fitting in different dimensions, but for those like me, we are physicians or epidemiologists working with human health. The main question is how this evidence that we are progressively transgrading planetary boundaries, which is the implications for human health. And I've been for more than 30 years teaching how environmental pollution affects human health, so unidirectionally, and seeing the environment as a harm for human health. And here the question is totally broader and much more complex. And the idea that we can reconcile this evidence with human health came to me after reading this paper in 2015. And the title of the paper is Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch. And they proposed a new concept of planetary health. When I read the paper in 2015, I'm not ashamed to say that I didn't know anything about Anthropocene. Okay? And the reason for which this paper catch my attention since the beginning is because it started with a paradox. And the paradox was, for 30 or 40 years, we have been seeing the health of the planet going down, and during these decades, it has been a phenomenal improvement of human health, with a lot of inequalities, right, but improvements in life expectancy, population size, prevalence of diseases. And then how we can explain that if environment is important for humans, human health has been improving at the time that the planet's health has been worsening. And then they say, well, the explanation is clear. We have been improving human health because we have been mortgaging the resources of the planet to get health. And they propose the idea that in the future we need to define human health, taking into account the health of the planet as something that belongs to the definition of human health, not as an external driver. And then they propose this definition of planetary health, where the main message is that human health and the health of the planet should go together. I'm sure that this is for you obvious, but I can tell you it's not something obvious for the people working in the field of health sciences. Okay? So I came to this idea of suggesting how to understand in a more practical way the planetary health, and it's just what epidemiologists are very simple people. Instead of complex models, we do 2x2 tables, and then you have here the health of the human, the health of the planet, and very simplifying, dichotomical, good and bad. And then you can come to these situations which are good for humans and good for the planet, and in the other side, the ones that are bad for humans and bad for the planet, and the ones that are in between. So one of the main messages of what I am going to present you is that we came to the evidence that there are some strategies that are good for the health of the planet that are immensely good for the health of the humans. And this is what we call co-benefits. And Estela has told you about the agro-food systems. So the sustainable food systems, as you will see, are one of the situations that can be tremendously good for the planet and for the humans. And you obviously have this situation in which are bad for the planet but good for humans. We today know that health systems account for about 5 to 10% in high-income countries of greenhouse gas emissions. So these are good for the humans but are contributing to warming the planet. And at the end of the day, this is going to be bad for human health. And the same with the antibiotics. And in this extreme, you have one of the, it's a very good example, it's smoking, which produces 6 million deaths annually in the world. and it's considered one of the more destructive and contaminating agricultural practices in some areas in Africa, contributes to desertification. So the idea is that for human health, and what we have been talking until now about public health, environmental health protection, it's more and more we are talking about mitigation and adaptation. And then how we can put these ideas in a more practical context. You have here an example of mitigation. This is very similar to what Estela presented, that is basically about modeling, and modeling how policies that would be consistent with the Paris Agreement in the context of stopping warming to 1.5 degrees in transport, energy, and food systems, how much these policies would benefit human health. We have a relatively good understanding of the dose-response relationships between physical activity and mortality, nutrition and mortality, pollution and mortality. And when these dose-response relationships are translated into these models and using scenarios, then, for instance, these authors, people from Imperial College, they did two types of scenarios, but for the more conservative one, the policies that would be consistent with the Paris Agreement in these 9 countries altogether were able to prevent 1.2 million deaths per year due to improvements in air quality, about 6 million deaths prevented due to improvements in nutrition, and about 1.15 million deaths prevented due to improvements in physical activities. There are many studies like this with this type of modeling, showing convincingly that these type of mitigation policies are tremendously beneficial for human health. Neil Markandaya in the BC3 in the Basque Country has done several studies, some of them highly cited, showing that when you put at the global scale the economic benefit of saving these lives, the cost of life, the economic benefit is equivalent to the cost of the mitigation policies at the global scale, which is, I mean, a very relevant message. Well, for some of the impacts, probably there is too late for mitigation, and obviously we need to mitigate, but some of the impacts will be here for the next century. I mean, heat waves are going to be here for the next century. Then the issue is adaptation, how we can adapt human health to these impacts. And you know, for human health, now many cities or countries, in high-income countries, we have heat wave plans. So, and you know, we're very familiar with this. So we start to see in the newspapers there is a heat wave. The local council starts to call the old people. Then this is the summer 2002, and this is a study that was led by Joan Ballester here in the ES Global, in the PRBB. And we did this study because during the summer of 2022, we were surprised that there were no reliable information about how many people was dying due to the heat waves during 2022. That was it was a summer of records. And then we decided to do a study for Europe, putting together the best data available. It took 1 year to get the data, because in every country is different. The only alternative was to use weekly data, but there is very good evidence that this is a good approximation. We calculated that this summer there was 60,000 excess deaths due to increased temperature in Europe, 60,000. There was about 12,000 in Spain. The mortality, morbidity systems that we say officially, they say 4,000, okay? There are different studies. There is an independent study for Spain, not for Europe, from a guy from CSIC. It's consistent with the 11 to 12,000 for Spain. So this is it's a very unfortunate evidence that the heat wave plants do not protect human health today. So the people that like me are starting to be beyond the 70 years old. So summer is a killer, and it will be a killer for the next decade. So we need to escalate adaptation plans. This is the other one. So these are the two very good examples of what we think is planetary health, which is the health of the humans together with the health of the living beings and the health of the planet. Okay? So when we say planetary health, we don't say the health of the planet. So we have the human health together with the health of the living beings and the health of the planet. There are many fields in which this approach is growing. Integrated land use solutions, sound management of chemicals, sustainable food systems, sustainable cities. So this is good news in our field. And in all these fields, probably the approach of planetary health is relatively similar. And if I had to summarize the approach in 4 concepts, I would say one is to move from our traditional linear models or multivariate models or to complexity and uncertainty, to go from the level of the speciality that we are working today to a different scale of multidisciplinarity, and then to act with urgency, taking into account the equity gap. And very shortly, we'll put you an example of each one. Well, this is about complexity. Most of my research has been trying to understand why in the last 30, 40 years, we have moved from having almost no allergy or asthma in our societies to having 20%, 30%, 40% in some countries of people with allergy of asthma. And after 30 years working on this field, I recently published a paper saying why epidemiology has not succeeded in identifying the causes of the asthma epidemic. But one of the possible explanations is the biodiversity hypothesis that has been mentioned before in the context of the microbiome. Tari Hatela in Finland, he did studies that were very interesting, looking to the 2 borders of the Finnish-Russian border, where you have the Karelian population, the same genetic background, some living in a totally different lifestyle, very rural in Russia, and some others in another Western style in Finland. And you see here, there is in those who were born in Russian Karelia, there was almost no allergy. This is measured with sensitization to birch pollen. But in those that were born in the Finnish Karelia, it's up to 25% sensitization. And this is probably mimicking what has happened at a global scale. And then he came to the theory that this may be due to the microbial deprivation, because he did studies in this area showing that the microbiome of your surroundings, I mean, the dust near to your home or the dust at home or the microbiome in the vegetables surrounding you are very correlated with the microbiome in the skin. And the microbiome in the skin is correlated to some immunological parameters that may be related to asthma and allergy. And they came to this idea that this loss of microbial diversity may be a causal factor of epidemic increase in autoimmune diseases, in allergy, in other chronic inflammatory diseases. But the problem is that we cannot reconcile this low-scale evidence with the distribution of asthma in the world. It's extremely difficult. And probably this is a challenge of complexity. So we need to find a way to move from studies showing associations between microbiome in the skin or in the dust with asthma to understand which is the relationship of the immune function in humans in relation to the microbiome in our environments. So this is a challenge for complexity. For this challenge, you need to move to another scale of multidisciplinarity. And this is very theoretical. This is one of the last papers of Will Stephen with other colleagues, proposing an updated conceptual model of the Earth systems. I'm totally ignorant about Earth systems, so it's probably not very prudent that I talk about this in this audience. But what I found fascinating is that he said, well, we need to reconcile in a conceptual model the geosphere, the biosphere, and the anthroposphere. And obviously, for me, this is the way in which we are studying asthma and allergy. And they say, well, basically, the picture is to understand our interactions in terms of production and consumption that are driven by energy systems and that are shaped by our societies, institutions, political economy, culture, values, knowledge, science. And in this paper, he makes a very, very exciting elaboration of which can be the pathway to develop quantitative models that can integrate this level of complexity. And obviously, this is very challenging. Today, there have been several presentations in which you can understand that at the top of the incredible complexity you have been showing, we need to add the complexity of human behavior, believings, economy, etc. And it may seem totally unrealistic, but I found that a step forward, it was this study last May in Nature, well, not last May, there was the safe and just air systems. And very interestingly, the same people that have been working with the planetary boundaries joined forces with people working in social sciences. And basically, there was Joyeta Gupta, which is she's the second author of the paper. She's a specialist in environmental justice. And then they have been able to put together two different criteria to assess the boundaries. One is the traditional one, the safety, that you have seen in the first slide. So which are the parameters, the CO2 concentrations or the pH in the oceans, which are the parameters that measure the safety of the system. But the other criteria is justice. And then they are trying to put together the two concepts. And then very interestingly, this is related to human health. And for instance, for the climate, where they say the IPCC is saying 1.5 degrees, not more than 2, but they say, well, if you take into account which are the consequences of the current increase in temperature in terms of mortality, which are hundreds of thousands every year, especially in the more vulnerable populations, after doing some modeling, they came to the conclusion that probably the boundary should be set below 1 degree, which obviously is politically totally unrealistic. But this is what the impact of climate change in humans today means. The other is for aerosols. They have one aerosols, which this idea that the interhemispherical aerosol optical depth is related to changing the monsoon regimes and altering the full climate. And they came to the idea that one of the components of these aerosols is air pollution, is PM 2.5, that is produced by fossil fuel combustion engines. Okay? So if you take into account the impact of this pollution in humans, it is about 8 million deaths per year, so it's more than smoking. Well, this contribution of the aerosols, the air pollution produced by our combustion of fossil fuels, it corresponds to just a parameter, the interhemispherical aerosol optical depth of 0.17, which is much stringent than the one that is set for the safety of the boundary. So for an impact that it's not yet beyond the safety boundary, we are really having an impact that is unacceptable from the justice point of view. So I found that this is a very interesting way of integrating social sciences with biological sciences and earth sciences. And finally, two very important concepts that go together. So we need to act with urgency. And it was one question before with the agro safety when Estela was showing the Paris, I mean, the models for Paris and the models upstream. No? And you were saying, well, the farm policy in Europe, it's really not transformative. It's probably what this concept that came from the GeoSig report. It says, well, most of our policies today are improved policies regarding to business as usual, but nevertheless totally insufficient to keep with the deterioration, with the transgression of the boundaries. And the challenge is that we need transformative policies. Okay? To put this in a more local example, I mean, to me personally, the superblocks project in Barcelona is a type of transformative policy. I mean, improving green or planting more trees or gardening inside of the blocks, it's at best this type of integrated policy. So the challenge is how we do, is not whether these are feasible or not. Obviously they are feasible, but the problem is how we reconcile the conflicts that these policies generate. I mean, and one of the main conflicts probably has to do with equity. And this is my last slide, showing, came from a recent paper, it's the global carbon inequality, was published in Nature Sustainability in 2022, and it shows the emission reduction requirement to meet the Paris Agreement in the United States. Okay, but the graphic in Europe looks pretty similar. And then you have in blue where we are now, in red, which is the reduction we need to keep the goal of 2030, 40% reduction, 45% reduction in emissions. And then you have here the bottom 50% population, the ones that are emitting less, the 50% that are emitting less, the 10% that are emitting more, and the 40% in the middle. And the 50% that are emitting less are just, they don't need to, they are on the goal. Okay? The problem in relative terms is the top percent, which are really emitting a lot more than they should, and probably in absolute terms also the middle, because the middle is much more common. And then all policies that don't take into account the equity imbalance are likely to be extremely hard to implement. Well, this is a new field of work, planetary health, something that we started 5 years ago. This is some of the people I am working with and have the opportunity to learn from them. Catherine Ton is leading projects on climate and health and using scenarios and modeling similar to the ones that we saw for agroforest. Cristina is doing studies in the Amazonia looking to the impact of industrial pollution in indigenous population. Ariana is managing projects in UPF, in the Planetary Wellbeing Unit. Mari Carmen is helping us to keep all the things going on. Nacho is a political scientist. Margarita Triguero is leading an European project on urban green and mental health. And just to finish, this is a photography. This is a sculpture. It's an artwork by Isaac Cordal. He did in Sumatra in an effort to take the attention for the consequences of palm oil plantation. His artwork indeed are small sculptures. This is before the COVID, okay? And this is a photography. He also does photography. It's a photography that Isaac Cordal took from a young girl that went there to see the small sculpture, and it gives me a sense of hope for the challenges that we have ahead. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation and questions.
It's very late for questions, probably.
So I have a quick one, and I was wondering when you were presenting, I mean, it's, I guess you've been thinking a lot of that on how to reconcile, I mean, all these, let's say, new solutions to our problematics with, you know, economic growth, the ideas of economic growth, capitalism, and all that. How to reconcile that? I mean, and you have economists in your team that are trying to see how, you know, idealistically we could implement all this. The message is clear, but we have the economic side sometimes, and we are still in a system that, you know, try to optimize, you know, the profit and so on. So how you deal with those ideas?
Yeah, I think in general our frame is that there is plenty of evidence of solutions. There is plenty of evidence that these solutions are economically viable. So the big challenge is the political viability and also the scale of implementation, I think, this is the big challenge. For the political, I cannot say much. I mean, I think it's extremely complex field. I am not a political scientist, but one of the things that we are interested is in learning from interventions. It's a huge amount of interventions going on, and there is and it's not easy to know about the interventions that are going on, and most of them are not evaluated. So there is a lot of interest in understanding from the interventions that are in many cities at regional scale, some at the country level. And it was a paper a few months ago, I think it was even a few weeks ago, in the Lancet. It was called the Lancet Pathfinder Commission, that has done a huge work to look to systematic reviews and real literature to identify hundreds of interventions. And they have been able to put together these interventions, like the Barcelona blocks. It was not one of the interventions because the people has not done economic evaluation. But for the hundreds that they have been able to review, they have been able to provide a metric that puts together reductions in environmental impacts together with improvements in human health. And then from these interventions you can learn a lot. I mean, this is the, but obviously we need to make this also a field of research. I mean, there is no research about these interventions. I mean, it's a shame. Yeah.
So on one of the more specific examples that you gave, but relating to, I think, your paper about why it'd still be difficult to prove or pin down the increase in asthma and allergies and all of that. So I guess I still don't, in a way, understand. You've got this beautiful example, or apparently beautiful example, of a controlled experiment across the border, the Russian side and the Finnish side, and I've seen a little bit about it. But why, so still why at the end of the day, or what do you think is the reason why you're saying that this is not somehow letting us unravel this question across the world?
Yeah.
That particular example is very well controlled and very clean result, apparently. Yeah. But you're saying that still it actually has not helped us understand across the planet what's going on.
I think that there are two types of challenges. One is understanding the relationship between human immunity and microbes. It is still very, very, unmature. The example I have shown you, it's a weak example, by the way. But there are several extremely strong examples. I mean, for instance, there have been repeated studies in farms in Austria and Germany showing that the children that have an early contact with the farm environment, sometimes at the pregnancy stage, at the fetal development level, they have zero allergy. They seem to be totally protected from allergy. And the people that has been leading these studies, Erika von Mutius in Germany and others, they are totally convinced that it's probably the presence of some specific microbes, but they have been totally unable to identify the microbes or to identify the proteins, and there are genetic studies. So one level is the complexity between the interactions between microbes and immunity, that it's probably a complex physiological state. And the other is, let's assume that this is true, okay? And the explanation is biological deprivation. And then what we see that there is a huge variations in time and geography for asthma epidemic. In some countries has grown almost epidemically, 25% of the population has asthma and 40% has allergy. In some others it's much less. But then imagine, assuming that the problem is microbial deprivation, how can you model the distribution of microbial deprivation at the global scale together with the distribution? And this is another big challenge. I mean, these are the things, the two challenges that I can dream to one day someone be able to solve. But so far it's really difficult.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, any other question? Okay, if not,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, and thanks all of you for being here, for all the speakers. I think this gave a lot of context to the stop of TREC in Barcelona. And also I see some potential interactions with our colleagues from MBEL next door that maybe perhaps in the future we will do more things together. Remember that the AML can be visited and it's parked on the back of the institute, and that tomorrow we have this networking event at 7 p.m. So if some of you want to come, I mean, there's just sign up. I mean, there's a link going around. I can distribute it again. Yeah, I enjoy a lot the day. I hope you too. And yeah, let's use this as a really good welcome to TREC to the city.